Thank you for joining us for this session on developing a learning contract. I'm Laura Lewis, the Director of Field Education here at the School of Social Work, and I'm here today with my colleagues Margie Courtley, Zoe Costin, and Catherine Griswold. So welcome to our students and educators that are participating. On your screen is a list of topics that we're going to cover. We'll begin today's discussion by exploring the competency and practice behavior terminology that you find in the learning contract and connecting this to the competency-based movement in social work education. We'll then review how to construct a well-written learning contract and the role of supervision. We'll briefly touch on evaluation. Evaluation is accomplished using the learning contract form, and then we'll have time at the end to answer your questions. So we know that many of the questions that you'll have are related to particular competencies, and we're prepared to discuss sample activities. At this time, I'd also like to mention that the handouts are available today on the web page for the webinar. In order to ask questions of presenters today, you can either email swfield@buffalo.edu or you can call 829-5839. One of our field staff members will take your question and relay it to presenters, and we'll be answering questions for the last 15 or 20 minutes of the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the presentation today. In social work field education, field has been recognized as the signature pedagogy. What we mean by that is that field education represents the central form of instruction in social work. Field is where our profession socializes students to perform the role of practitioner. Field is also where the theoretical and conceptual contribution of the classroom are connected to real-world settings. So field education becomes increasingly important with the Council on Social Work Education, or CSWE, the accrediting body of social work, on the attainment of competencies. Briefly, competency-based education emphasizes the measurement of skill attainment as the primary focus of training, and student readiness for practice is measured against a set of core competencies. As a signature pedagogy, field is where competencies are best demonstrated. So here's one particular competency, number 1 on the learning contract. Identify as a professional social worker, apply social work ethical principles to guide professional practice and conduct oneself accordingly, and the related practice behaviors associated with it. You can think about the competency as the overarching goal. The practice behaviors associated with each competency are the components or ingredients. I should note that the competencies and practice behaviors that appear on the learning contract were actually generated by CSWE, by the Council on Social Work Education. Our faculty and staff revised them and added additional language and then approved the School of Social Work practice behaviors and competencies that you see on the learning contract. So again, the overall competency is what students are reaching for. You might think of them as the final destination, with the practice behaviors being important steps along the way. At this point, Margie Courtley is going to come up for the next part of the presentation.
So I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the learning contract. We should note that it was revised this year. So for those of you that have used a learning contract before, you'll notice some differences to that. Both the foundation year and advanced year contracts are located on the School of Social Work web under the essential forms, and you'll find that under field education. The learning contract is a tool that organizes and provides structure for students' field placement experience while incorporating opportunities that are available at the specific placement site. The learning contract is also the basis for evaluating student performance and progress in achieving the 6 core competencies, as Laura had mentioned earlier, that are expected of students in field. This learning contract form is also the evaluation form, and we'll be briefly discussing the evaluation at the end. The learning contract is jointly developed by the student, the field educator, and if you're in a site that has a task model, the task supervisor should also be included in the development of the learning contract. No one should be working in isolation on the learning contract itself. The learning contract also sets the stage for agency expectations and the School of Social Work requirements, including meeting the competencies in social work. The learning contract provides the criteria for assessing student progress toward achieving the competencies. So students are assessed and evaluated on their demonstration of practice behaviors, as well as knowledge and skills demonstrated through the learning activities available in the field placement. Development of the learning contract helps to give parameters of what the particular placement site has to offer in terms of learning experiences for the student. It also gives the student an idea of what their role is as an MSW intern, sort of the scope of the responsibility that they'll have at the placement site over the course of the year. We want you to remember that your faculty field liaison is available to assist you, and you should not feel alone as a student or an educator trying to develop your learning contracts. And the faculty liaison, you should think of them as part of your educational team to support the learning experience in field. So part of that role is to answer site-specific questions while you're working on and developing your learning contracts together. The faculty liaison is also the person that the student submits a signed copy of the learning contract to for their input and feedback, which they may give you once you submit the learning contract. Remember, our mutual goal is building student competencies, and a well-written contract is part of the key to reaching that goal. So let's talk about some of the elements that we think are important to construct a well-written learning contract. We allow about a month of time from the time a student begins field placement until the time that the learning contract is due to the liaison. This really gives students and field educators time to discuss individual student learning needs, for the students to share with their field educator their course syllabi and course assignments, to talk about areas of strength and areas for growth, and match these with the agency opportunities and projects that are available at their placement site. It also gives students the time to learn more about the agency, its mission, vision, areas of service provision, the role of social workers in the setting that they're in, and all of that they keep in mind when constructing the learning contract. Again, the learning contract is your foundation for the learning experience that you'll have in field. We want you to know that it can be modified as needed as well, that over time sometimes you think you're going to be conducting a particular task or activity, and that may change. So that's not a problem, but you need to inform the faculty liaison if there are significant changes to that learning contract. What this does here is, this is a visual for you of combining the essential elements that we just talked about, combining them together in developing your learning contract. So what you see is you have the agency and the student. So here you're looking at the agency's expectations of students in field, their learning and educational opportunities that they have available, and you're combining that with the student and their strengths, their interests in field, in social work, their experiences they've had already, their learning needs, what are their assignments in class, and together you're combining that with the requirements in practicum and really building on student competencies in social work. Again, offering the opportunity to demonstrate behavioral outcomes and practice behaviors. So the result of that combination is a mutually agreed upon learning contract that will enable students to gain knowledge and skills and put them into practice in field. Laura's going to talk a little bit more about writing activities.
Thanks, Margie. So what you see now on the screen are some helpful questions that can guide your discussion with students, with educators. As Margie mentioned, considering student interests and agency and practicum requirements can be helpful when developing the learning contract. Keeping in mind individual student development, some helpful questions to ask yourself are, what specific competencies are required for professionals in my setting? What competencies would I hope to observe in a well-trained colleague? And then, what competencies would a student be expected to have developed at the end of their placement? And again, a reminder that we're aiming for competence at the level of foundation student and at the level of an advanced year student. Students are not going to be leaving at the end of their MSW degree competent to the level of a practicing social worker with years of experience, for example. So the questions and tips that I'm reviewing now are posted as part of the handouts that are available to you on the webinar webpage. It can also be helpful to ask yourself, how can we individualize and tailor activities to the needs of the community being served? For example, can students be compiling a list of community resources, either for staff or for individuals who are being served? Are there outreach and education efforts that are made possible by having an MSW intern? Are there policies that can be researched? Literature reviews done on best practices? On other types of assessment or tools that can be used in the setting? Secondly, ask yourselves, what will I observe the student doing? And so think behavioral. Think, if you're an educator, about treatment plans that you were trained to write. You have to really think about what will you see and hear at the time of a student's attainment of competency. The activity needs to be behaviorally explicit so that student progress can be measured. And you might think in terms of products or artifacts that a student would produce, for example, a report or a presentation. But evidence can also be something that's reviewed just by communication and supervision. And Zoe Costin will be talking shortly about the role of supervision in developing a learning contract. So, again, a reminder, activities should be behaviorally explicit. You have to measure and evaluate, otherwise how will you know when goals are met? Think about, what do you see or hear? What evidence is there that lets you know the student has been successful? And here are some helpful verbs. Interview, write, observe, develop, understand. Plugging these into your learning contract activities should help point you in the right direction. And I'll pull out an example. Co-lead. Students will co-lead a social skills group, for example. That may be an activity. Demonstrating the ability to engage with group members effectively, exhibiting positive regard and openness, and reflecting on that experience in supervision. That would be an example of a really good activity. And another way to think about activities is the degree to which they have a level of depth. So using the previous example of running a support group, you might consider the work a student must do prior to running the group. In a school setting, for example, the process of recruiting participants and obtaining parent permission. practicing skills that they'll need to be able to be effective as a leader in a group. You might also think about how a student might evaluate success at the end. Are they measuring member progress on any goals or key indicators? Are they measuring participant satisfaction? So this kind of revised activity would fit nicely under competency number 5, engaging in research-informed practice and practice-informed research. So there are a number of ingredients that can be included in activities, and the picture on this slide is meant to represent that. If you think of an activity as a recipe of sorts, what we're aiming for is more of a souffle than an omelet. Okay, Zoe Costin is going to talk about the role of supervision next.
Okay, great. Thank you, Laura. We recognize that supervision is certainly a very large subject, and so for the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to be focusing on supervision within the specific confines of thinking about supervision regarding the learning contract. We also have other resources available, such as reviewing developmental supervision, which is on the School of Social Work Field Education website. We're going to also have further discussions in the future about supervision. And as was mentioned earlier, don't forget to consider your faculty liaison as a resource. And certainly those of us in the field department are a resource as well. For supervision, the one important thing to remember is that what you're doing is you're modeling that you're modeling a skill for the student. Receiving and giving supervision is a social work skill, and that's something that's important to remember, that that's one of the goals that you're going to be hoping for. So one thing that we strongly encourage is for the supervisor to establish an agenda for the supervision meeting. An agenda is merely an agreement between the two of you on what you're going to discuss each week. I think sometimes people feel like, oh, well, that's so formal, and we prefer to keep it much more casual. The problem, though, with keeping it very casual is that sometimes it's a surprise to the student about what's going to be expected for the student to talk about. So if the student knows exactly what is expected in supervision, the student will be able to better be prepared, to be able to review cases, to discuss follow-up issues from the previous week, and to summarize what the tasks are going to be for the upcoming week. One technique that I like to use, I think this is very good for supervision, it's also good for family meetings, a good technique to have, is at the end, the student should be able to say, okay, can you summarize for me, so I know we're both on the same page, what are your going to be tasks for this week? So just summarize the supervision meeting. Another technique could be to have the student email just a brief summary of what was discussed in supervision. Again, it helps to make sure that you're both on the same page. It also is going to be something that makes it a lot easier during evaluation time to know what you discussed each week. And quite honestly, it's going to be a great tool for the student to be able to look back at those notes at the end of the semester, at the end of the year, to really reflect upon all the student has learned. And we know that that's an important tool. This also, the idea of the agenda, increases productive communication. It increases autonomy for the student. It helps the student understand the skill of utilizing clinical supervision, which we all know that we are not born with that technique necessarily. One thing that should be on the agenda is to review the learning contract each week. It's really important to think of the learning contract as your course syllabus. In a regular course, you would not wait until the end of the semester and look at it and say, gosh, I hope I really covered everything here. It wouldn't be like that. What you'd be doing is looking at it every week, thinking about what is the assignment, what is the purpose of the assignment, and that's exactly what we want you to do with the learning contract. Educational learning within supervision. Students are at a field placement to learn skills through the activities they will experience at your agency. This is unlike an employee, where the employee's focus is to learn a specific job at your agency. Does that make sense? The difference being that an employee really is there to learn about a specific job, but the student is there to learn the skills necessary to either be at your agency or other places. And that's really should be the difference in the focus. This is the area that I like to say as far as thinking about the big picture. One of the ways that you're going to be able to assist as a field educator, assist the student to learn in an educational way, is to be able to identify teachable moments. One of those ways is to be able to give the big picture. Let's say you assign a student to spend 2 hours each week at the reception area. The student is going to be answering the telephone for incoming calls. They're going to be greeting clients. They're going to be basically doing everything that's needed at that, what I'll, for this purpose, just call the reception area. If you send the student off to this task without further explanation, a student may feel frustrated and unclear as to why they would be doing this task. They may even think that this was just assigned to them because the agency is short-staffed versus that this was assigned to them because it is a valuable learning experience. However, if first you explain to the student that the reason you want them to do this task is so, for example, that they might be able to be learning better as far as the agency services, because the more questions that are asked of them, the more they're going to need to learn to be able to direct the calls properly. They're also going to have the opportunity to be observing clients coming in. And you may want to ask that student to think about, what do you think it's like to come into this agency for services? What do you think that experience might be like? But if you're not down in the reception area, you're really not going to get a sense of that. The student is also going to have an opportunity to observe the clients as they come in, quite honestly, before the client may have been receiving services, before that client may have felt like they're being assessed and analyzed. The student can also provide a very good service about making people feel welcome. All those things the student would be watching for. However, if you had not mentioned all those things, the student might not have gotten as big or as broad of an experience. The other really, really important thing is for you to be talking about those observations and thoughts that the student would have had, talk about it in supervision. Maybe you can have the student be thinking about, all right, they're going to be working on trauma-informed care curriculum in their courses. Maybe they can have some suggestions on what can the agency do that would be more welcoming, that would make this less of a stressful experience. It doesn't mean you have to enact all those things, but the discussion is really what's valuable there. And where does that happen? It happens in supervision. Students, if you don't understand the reason for a task, please remember to ask your supervisor what you should be looking for and why. Supervisors want you to ask questions. That's really, really important for you to think about. The other thing about supervision is this is an opportunity to have the learning contract come to life. It's really important to have this feel like it's a working document that is something as you would use one of your textbooks, as you would use anything that's educational. That's really important for you to look at an activity and say, well, the reason that we put it in this objective area is because I really wanted to be focusing on learning about group intervention skills. We know activities can often fit in more than one area. You're not going to be able to learn every skill in this experience, but the learning contract is going to help you feel more focused about that. All right. Evaluation. There are really two types of evaluations. One is ongoing. So this is provided through regular feedback. The old adage of no news is good news is not productive. Don't assume that the student knows they are doing well or not, even though you have not given them that feedback. It's really important to be able to get in the habit of giving that feedback. I think many of us, it is not necessarily something natural that we would do in our everyday life. It is definitely a skill to be able to give that feedback. So if that's something as a supervisor you really don't have a lot of experience with, that would be something that you would want to either talk to your supervisor about or brainstorm with peers. You can also utilize your faculty liaison on good techniques to use as far as being able to give feedback. Also, students, please remember that your field educator needs feedback too. Using a statement like, I appreciated the feedback you gave me the other day. I thought about what you had to say, and I wanted to talk to you about some additional thoughts that I had. In that, what you would be doing is telling the field educator you really thought about what they had to say and that you value their opinion and feedback. It's important for all of us to get those reminders. The other kind of evaluation is certainly formal written evaluation. In this case, certainly that would be the midterm evaluation at the end of the first semester and the final evaluation, obviously, at the end of the second semester of the field placement. There should not be any surprises. That's really important. Please make sure that you are talking about progress and communicating on what is necessary to improve upon a skill and making sure that the student knows when they are doing well. Just because someone's doing well doesn't mean that they can't continue to grow. We certainly all know that if we are not continuing to learn and grow, then something's wrong. So that's important to be thinking about as well. Please consider using the handout, the learning contract definitions and tips. By looking at that, one thing that you're going to notice are a couple of pointers in there about the learning contract. On the last page of it, you will just see a one-page summary snapshot of Competency 2, just for as an example, and it goes over some of the expected outcomes. At the bottom of that page, it shows what the key is for the evaluation. The first is listed as AC, Advanced Competence. Expertly demonstrates awareness, knowledge, and skills as a graduate social work intern. I'm not going to go over each one of these. If you have questions, I want you to contact the liaison. And what you want to do is think about these competency and how it's evaluated with the student that you have in front of you. We recognize that different students learn at different paces, but it's important to think about that. When you're thinking about these, please think, is a student using initiative? Are they, if they ask a question, are you able to say, before you answer that, are you able to sometimes say, well, what do you think about that? Has the student thought about questions before they come to you? Do they come to supervision prepared? Think about those total pictures, and that's the kind of thing that you want to evaluate on, as well as the activities. What's important to think about is behavioral terms. Hopefully you've really heard enough about that to have a sense of it. It's important to provide feedback regarding the student's ability to demonstrate skills. It is not about liking or not liking your student. We want all the students to be successful, but unless we give students the feedback that they need to be able to work on the skills that are important to have, then they're less likely to be successful. So that's what we need you to do, is to really think about that. All right, next we're going to have an opportunity, oh, excuse me, no, I didn't do the next. The learning contracts, you can see for the next slide, tips and resources, learning contracts, web search of activities. You can go on to the field education website in this, for the School of Social Work. What you would do is go in the learning contract area, and under that you would be clicking on web search for activities. There is a long list of activities that are available there. And, oh, do we have that slide? Here we go. Oh, okay, I forgot that we can click on here, I'm sorry. And what we want you to do is, as you can see up on the screen, thanks Laura, as you can see up here, so this is a snapshot of what's on our website. So here we are, field education activities list. What you would do is go down to student type, as you can see the cursor at the bottom. It would say advanced year, foundation year. So I'm just going to click on foundation year. Then what you would be doing is checking, clicking learning objective. So we would be choosing one. One that Laura had mentioned earlier, one activity that sometimes people find challenging to think about activities for is number 5, engage in research-informed practice, and we're going to click on that one and click submit. What you can see are a long list of suggested activities. These should be used as discussion points. Our expectation is not that you necessarily use this verbatim, but that what you would do, you and the student would do, is look at these and see, do any of these fit? just going to number 1 as an example, apply information from SW 510 to evaluate research studies related to practice at field agency, discuss with the field educator. What's important about this is it's integrating what's happening in the classroom with what's happening in the field placement. The other important point here is to discuss with field educator, talk about that in supervision if that's one of the activities that was chosen. Utilize specific engagement techniques, identify these, effectively assessing client needs, discuss with the task supervisor and field educator. So again, you can look at this. We wanted to make sure that you knew that this was a resource for you. And if you have suggestions about activities, you can also submit those on, if we go back, there's a place that says, please click here to share your field activities, and then that would be an area to submit the suggested activities. Now we will have an opportunity to answer your questions. Please consider calling or emailing as directed in the webinar directions. And Laura is going to